my man James Baldwin, had it right. Quote, "The horror is that America changes all the time without ever changing at all." Now, to my mind, y'all all right? I'm just checking on you. All right, y'all gonna have to talk back to me now. Now, to my mind, any consideration of the stakes of racial justice in the future of American democracy requires that we venture to the heart of the matter. It is an occasion to examine the deep contradiction that shaped and shapes this country, a contradiction rooted like the tangled knots of an old Mississippi oak in this idea that white people ought to matter more than others, and the lies we tell ourselves to protect us from the ghastly implications of it all. It is hard to admit for some, but I must say, especially now, that the American idea is in trouble. In fact, it has been in some form of trouble the moment it was given shape and texture. We tell ourselves that we are an example of democracy achieved, that we are the shining city on the hill, but these stories aim to conceal the contradiction at the heart of this fragile experiment in democracy. Baldwin put it this way in 1964, quote, "The people who settled the country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. For if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed." And then Baldwin says, "That lie is the basis of our present trouble," end quote. We know this country has been and continues to be a place where the value gap affects the distribution of advantage and disadvantage, that we have created a way of life where some are valued and have standing, while others must experience what philosophers describe as a generalized sense of disregard. Our history betrays us repeatedly on this score. We know governmental policy in the post-World War II era gave birth to the vaunted American middle class, and we know that African Americans were systematically locked out of those benefits, the benefits of those policies, and we know that African Americans were systematically locked out of the American dream. We know, we think about redlining, we think about residential segregation, we think about bank policies. We know that we have built the country true, that racial inequality is not the result of happenstance, it's the result of policy decisions. Ours is the world we built. And we also know, although we don't want to admit it, because to do so would be to acknowledge what I'm saying, and to do that would be to admit to the crime, that there's a different form of policing for black people here than there is for white folk. All we have to do is think back to January 6th and compare how the police responded to that mob and how they responded to some of the peaceful protests last summer, yes? I gotta watch my time. Let me keep going. We have too long told ourselves a story that secures our virtue and protects us from our vice. But today we confront the ugliness of who we are. We are in a kind of cold civil war. Millions of Americans feel that the country has turned its back on them, that the browning of America represents a distinct decline, and some among them decided, as I said, to sack the Capitol because they believed the election was stolen. They believe that only white votes matter. January 6th then was fueled by white resentment, white grievance, and white fear. It was a moment when the cold Civil War turned hot. And we heard either that night or the next day, I can't remember, an echo of the past on the Senate floor. Senator Ted Cruz invoked the presidential election of 1876. The Compromise of 1877 as a framework to settle the dispute around the certification of the election, and he invoked it against the backdrop of an insurrection that left shit on the walls of the people's house. History reveals itself here not as determination, but as a kind of inheritance, not as continuity, but as connection and relation, where one event echoes or carries the imprint of another and calls it all into view. Historical facts and personages don't simply appear twice, but in multiple forms and ways, like a blurred image with layers and depth that interrupt, intercede, folds back, and calls forth. Now, all of that is a bit abstract. In short, we've been here before. In those moments of trouble, when we've had a chance to imagine America anew, in those moments when the contradiction seized the American heart, we have witnessed over and over again the reassertion of the value gap and the lies that provided cover. Think about the Civil War and radical Reconstruction, what historians refer to as the Second Founding. What did we see? This is the moment, the formation of the modern U.S. nation state, the passage of the Civil War amendments. And what did we get in response? We got Jim Crow in the South. Frederick Douglass would live long enough to see the 13th Amendment ratified and witness the state of Mississippi pass the first Jim Crow law. He would call them the Apostles of Forgetfulness. All right? We see convict leasing, what historians call another form of slavery, where the state was deployed to conscript black labor to help build cities like Birmingham, Alabama. We see the ideology of Anglo-Saxonism guiding our imperial efforts across the globe. At the very moment in which we're consolidating racial apartheid in the American South, we're bringing millions of people of color under our rule in Cuba and the Philippines. Anglo-Saxonism is not the possession simply of the South, y'all. It's all of us. And this is why Hitler looks to the United States for a model, not necessarily for the Nuremberg laws, but for all the things that he's trying to imagine, right, in Hitler's Germany. The same thing happened in the mid-20th century. Black freedom struggle demanded broad-based inclusion. Historians refer to this period as the Second Reconstruction, an attempt to fulfill the broken promises of the first. And what did we get in response? The election of Richard Nixon twice. Calls for law and order, the tax revolt in California, which laid the foundation for the shredding of the social safety net, and eventually the election of Ronald Reagan. The last major piece of legislation passed in the Great Society was the Fair Housing Act of 1964. Ronald Reagan is elected 12 years later to undo it all. At each turn, when we have faced the kind of moral reckoning we now face, we have doubled down on our ugliness. At every turn, when a new America is about to be born, the umbilical cord of white supremacy has been wrapped around the baby's neck, choking the life out of it. We have cleaved to this idea of white America and left bodies in the wake. I came here to tell you the truth, Chautauqua. We've left bodies in the wake